Good morning. Today I will be presenting the breakdown of the flight shaming movement on the aviation industry and the on-flow effects to tourism. This presentation is by Group 3 and in Tutorial 2. Firstly, we'll be going through the background information, looking at the flight shaming movement and the industry as a whole, and then we'll move on to the economic principles, starting with demand, moving to supply, and then the overview of the short-term and long-term implications on the market equilibrium. And then finally, we will highlight the recommendations for the aviation industry and the consumers. Now, flight is one of the highest producing and fastest growing of individual emissions for CO2 within any sector. The aviation industry has contributed up to 2.4% of all global CO2 emissions in 2018. Now, to put this in perspective, this graph breaks down CO2 emissions, all of them per country. The CO2 emissions by the aviation industry account for more than a whole country. So that includes Australia, Italy, Poland, France. The aviation industry as a whole contributes more CO2 emissions than these entire countries. Now, looking at further details, the aviation industry contributes to 3.5% of anthropogenic climate change. In the last 5 years, we have seen a 27% increase in global CO2 emissions from commercial aviation industries. And this CO2 emission is expected to triple leading up to 2050 if there's no change or mitigation. But finally, luckily, we've seen that the aviation sector and the Global Commercial International Air Transport Association is committed to reducing carbon emissions by half by the year of 2050. Moving on from the CO2 impact of the aviation industry, how does this relate to flight shaming? Now, flight shaming is a movement founded in Sweden that aims to make people feel accountable for their carbon footprint produced by air travel and encourage them to move to more alternative ways of transport. Now, this has generated a decline in air travel growth. It's created losses for airlines, and it's increased awareness for environmental concerns and the need for individual responsibility in regards to climate change. Now, looking at the first economic principle analysis at demand, we see that within Sweden, there's been a decline in international and domestic flights that has been induced by flight shaming. This is clearly illustrated by the graph. Starting in 2017, when the flight shaming movement began, we see a 2.8% decline in international travel, and then an 8% decline in domestic demand for air travel. Now, globally, we have seen that the annual growth rate of passenger demand has seen a decline pre-COVID. So looking at the graph, we have an 8.1% in 2017 when it first began, and then we've seen a decline to 7.4% and then 4.2% in 2019, and then COVID hit. Now, overall, these demand indicators reflect that there's been a leftward shift in the consumer demand, especially in the domestically induced market within Sweden. And this has been obviously brought forth by the flight shaming movement. Following on from this reduction in demand for air travel, we have also seen an increase in demand for green travel. Globally, 66% of consumers prefer environmentally friendly products. Now, 54% of travelers within England choose more sustainable travel. The overall market for ethical travel is increasing, and if we look at this diagram, we see that two really joint effects. With the regular flights, the decrease in demand for these highly intensive CO2 travel has shifted that demand curve to the left, while also simultaneously we've seen the increase in demand for sustainable flights. Now, this has really created a relative price change and a substitutionary effect from regular flights to sustainable flights for a certain number of consumers. This new sustainable flights price equilibrium is more optimal for the utility for these consumers. Now, moving on from that, we're looking at the price elasticity of demand for sustainable flights. We see that as this growing wave of flight shaming really consumes more customers and more people, the inelasticity for sustainable flights increases. So they become more inelastic. They are more willing to pay for reduced carbon emissions than they were before. Now, the next economic principle we are evaluating is the supply. The nature of the supply side within the aviation industry is a service perishable good within a oligopoly structure. This is indicating low supply side competition and high pricing power within this industry. Looking at the industry's large fixed costs, we can see that there's aircraft financing, insurance, and salaries. And then the variable costs within that industry includes fuel, landing fees, food and beverages, and maintenance fees. Now, how does this flight shaming movement affect the supply side of the aviation sector? Firstly, we can look at the increased operating costs. We've seen a 3.8 billion offsetting costs per year. And if we look further into this, we see that this big negative externality of carbon emissions has been incorporated into tax. We've seen, because of this flight shaming movement, a big uptick in support for taxation within the aviation sector. This has been a growing view among Europe's politicians and electorates, and we've seen the introduction within Sweden for a per-trip aviation tax in April 2018. A carbon tax on jet fuel has been proposed in Europe, in the European Commission, and it's waiting for approval. Now we can look at this externality graphically. Looking at the market equilibrium at MPC1, quantity 1, P1, we see that the quantity demanded is further to the right and the price is down. But this isn't at the socially optimal level because it's not taking into account the negative externalities. So once we've seen this tax introduced, we've seen that there's been a push on the supply side to the socially optimal level. Now at Q2 and P2, although the price is higher, quantity demanded is lower. And we've seen that it's also generated tax revenues. So overall, we've seen that the free market equilibrium Q1 has been pushed. Now at the social equilibrium Q2, it's taken into account this external cost of production, and the carbon tax on the airline has increased the marginal private cost to MPC2. It's also reduced supply and generated tax revenue. The last economic principle that we are looking at is the market equilibrium. So we are really taking into account the effects on supply and demand and looking at it at a short-term view and a long-term view. And we've broken these views into two really main points. In the short term, we're looking at a demand curve that shifts, but the supply has not shifted along with it. So in this view, in this short term look at supply and demand market equilibrium, we've seen that because of this demand shift to the left, the new quantity demanded is reduced to Q2, and the price is also reduced. Now, moving on to long-term demand, we've seen that because of a joint shift in supply and demand, it's had two effects. Because the demand shift has been more prominent than the supply shift, we've seen a quantity demanded shift from Q1 to Q2 quite large. But with also the supply shift, we've seen that because it hasn't been as severe, we've seen that there's been a reduction in price, but not so much as the quantity demanded. So slight shift in price downwards and larger shift in quantity reduction. Now overall, this long-term effect has really created the effect that the flight shaming movement has been targeting, which is reduced flights and reduced carbon emissions. Moving on to conclusion. So, flight shaming movement shifts the demand curve to the right side by the substitutionary effect, the non-price factor. Carbon offsetting costs and tax increases the cost of aviation to companies, and this is in turn is reflected in the supply side shift, and the equilibrium price and quantity decreases due to the flight shaming movement. Now, moving on to the recommendations, we've seen for the industry that there's three main things they can do. Number one is offset carbon emissions, having this option during booking. This allows for customers to have that sustainable option within the regular flights, creating that substitutionary effect without going too far. And then also they can invest in environmental organizations and reduce plastic on flights. Now, for travelers, they can choose to offset. They can choose the sustainable path, they can fly directly, and they can fly lightly. And this moves that, this really has two main effects. The offsetting carbon emissions creates a positive externality that cancels out the negative externality equally. And this reduces carbon emissions, while also maintaining the ability to fly and travel for consumers. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Now, this has been a flight shaming movement presentation and the effect on aviation and tourism as a whole. Thank you.